Welcome back to React Tidbits. In this video, we're going to talk about the basics of React, the very basics. In the last video, we just talked about Create React App, which is an app for getting started with React. We didn't really discuss it. This time, we didn't really discuss React. This time we are, and we're going to jump in and see how this thing works. So I already have it running, and I have it here open in Atom, and I have it here open in the browser. So we are good to go. So this is an app created by Create React App. Let's talk about how React gets on the page. If we look in this public folder, we'll see an index file. And if we look in there, we'll find this div called root. The div here with this ID of root is where our React application will live. It's actually not controlling this no script. It's not going to be controlling lots of stuff here in the page. It's actually the React app itself is going to live inside this div. Since there isn't anything else, then this is going to be the entire app. But whenever you put React on a page, and this is very common for single page app type frameworks, what they're going to do is they're going to live in a spot on the page and control that spot, which means you don't actually have to have a React app that's completely taking control of the entire page. It can actually just be a portion. But in this case, and probably in all these videos, we're just going to go with this Create React App thing and just assume React is the entire page. And here it is, going to control that little root div. Now how does that work? If we look at this file called index.js, we'll see this, document.getElementById root. So that goes and grabs that div. And then here, right in front of it, what we're doing, or what React DOM is doing, is saying, okay, I'm going to take your React app, which is this thing, and I'm going to put it in this element on the page. So where does this come from? Where does this app? Well, this app comes from here, which comes from here, which is this file. So when you're doing your React apps, this is where you start. And usually I don't go into the index.js file. I never really open the index.html file. This is where I tend to live here, and then I create lots of other files for other React things. But this is where you generally start. And this is where we're going to spend our entire time today. So that's how React gets on the page ultimately, at least that's where it lives on the page. How it gets on the page is this stuff right here, which is not valid JavaScript. If you look at this, this is not JavaScript at all. This is something called JSX. What happens is Create React App uses Webpack to turn this and everything else in the app, along with using a bunch of other libraries to help all this transformation happen. Takes all this stuff, transforms it, combines it, and actually puts it on the page. This is primarily Webpack's doing. Now this right here is JSX. This is something particular to React. JSX is a combination of JavaScript and HTML, or I guess in a sense XML, because unlike HTML, it's very picky about closing tags. We'll probably get to that along the way. So this is what is called a React component, this bit from line 5 through line 19. Everything in React is essentially made up of React components. Every React component must have a render function. And so if we look at this right here, we can see this is a very minimal React component. It says render this stuff, and basically what we have here will show up here on the page. So if we take out all this content here, and if we don't need that, then we probably don't need this logo, and we save it, we go look here, we lose everything. This is the entire content of the app now gone. And I can put a paragraph back. And I'll see that show up. So a React is made up of components. And every component needs to have a render function. And what you put in here is what is going to be on the page. Often it's just going to be HTML and some properties. I'll show you that here in a second. HTML and a little bit of JavaScript mixed in to just put some values on the page. Sometimes you will actually have JavaScript function calls and whatnot here within this, and we will see that as well, though not in this video. We'll see that in the next one, where I will talk to you about creating multiple components with map. But in this one, we're just going to be talking about XML or HTML and putting values in. So here I've shown you how this component works. We can change it, we can add HTML, and it will show up here on the page. One of the key things about React components is you can always only return a single DOM element. It can have in it as many DOM elements as you want. Like, for example, this is totally fine. However, we can't come and do this. What happens is React will give you an error, and here's the error. Adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. That's what this is right here. What that means is you have to return only one single element. You can't have two sibling elements returned from this render function. If we fix that, then this will fix itself. So that's the basic idea of React component. At the very least, you have a class and a render. There are ways of creating components just out of functions. We will see that at a later time, but this is where you're going to start with your React components. A class and then a render, and in that render you're going to return some JSX. Sometimes that's just going to be HTML-like stuff. Sometimes that will be, and often that will be variables of some sort to make the generation of this HTML dynamic based on data and so forth, as if you've been doing programming for a while, as you're going to be used to. Okay, so now that that's done, let's talk about data. And so you've got two basic types of ways of storing and passing around data in React components. One of them is called state, one of them is called props. We're just going to talk about state this time. State is data that is changeable. Props is data that is not, at least not by the component that receives the props. But that's for another time. Here in this component, we're going to put some state. I'm going to create a constructor for this. Here in this constructor, I am going to put this super function. This super function is calling the constructor of component. If you don't have this super function and you save it, we'll go back here and we will see an error, missing super call in constructor. That is required. So I will put that back and we will see our error go away. This is the only place, in a constructor is the only place in a React component that we can set the state of the component like this. State in React is always an object, but everywhere else in the component you change state in a different way, and I will show you that here in a minute. So here is the initial state. I can set any value in here. This is just a regular JavaScript object, and I can then use it below. And so I can put a name in, and then put my name in. And then down here I can say hello, and then I need a way of referencing that state value. Well, I can jump into JavaScript by using curly brackets here. And I can say this, which will refer to this instance of the component, dot state dot name. And now that it's run again, we can see hello, Eric. Now, I mentioned there's two ways of setting state. In a constructor, this is how you do it. This is called the initial state of a component. And often, if you have state within a component, you'll set up an initial state, and then later on you will change it. If you ever want to change it, you have to call a function called setState. So I'm going to do that right here. So this is component did mount. This function is called once a component has been put or mounted, essentially, in the React component on the page. So component did mount will fire certainly after this constructor, because that'll be the first thing. This will fire after the component has been on the page. I want to do something, and that is I want to set this state. So setState is a function. We don't do this.state again. That's a no-no. Every other time we set state in the component, we do this. We call setState and we pass in an object. This object can have any sort of properties on it, and in this case I'm going to change the name to Bob. Now what will happen is the component sets its initial state to Eric, and then when the component is mounted, it calls setState and sets it to Bob. If we look here in the browser, we'll see that it is Bob. That's interesting. Let's do something. Let's add a console log here, a console log here, and a console log in the render. And here in the render, I want to also console log this.state. We'll see something interesting. If I come here to Chrome and open up the Chrome DevTools and open up the console, I'll see some interesting things. First of all, the constructor runs. That shouldn't be a surprise, but this is the constructor function to create the class, so it should happen first. That is expected. So that's all good. The next thing is it renders. So it renders, and it rendered with a state of Eric. Now we see Bob here, so this is not its current state. We see Bob there, but it renders first with Eric. Then component did mount fires, and then render fires again, and we see the name Bob. And so therefore we see Bob here in our final state. So why does it work this way? Well, whenever you create a component, and it's about to put it on the page, it's going to render the component with whatever state it has at that time. And at that time, when it first renders it, it has this default state, which says name Eric. And so it runs through render, and it's going to put it on the page. But then, right after it gets put there, it's going to call component did mount, which in that I call setState. Now, it's going to call render again because I called setState. And this is something we'll see lots throughout these videos. Components re-render, and by re-render I mean recall this function to get a new version of that component and then update the page. Components will re-render every time you call setState. setState can be called multiple times in a single function, and it won't double the re-renders because setState is what is called an asynchronous call. But essentially, logically, think of it as if you call setState, it's going to re-render. And that's what's going to cause it, specifically. And if you ever need to re-render, it's because, generally speaking, you're changing the state of the application. So this setState not only changes the value that is set in this setState, but causes the component to re-render. Now I want to add something else. I want to add a variable for count. And I'm going to go here into component did mount, and I am going to call setInterval. In setInterval, I'm going to change the state. I will use an arrow function here, and in here I'm going to call this.setState. And I'm going to increment that number every time this set interval is called. And I'm going to set that number to this.state.number, it's count, not number, silly, this.state.count plus 1, like so. Now that I have this count variable set, I can use it. So I'm going to go down here and change this useless paragraph to count and say this.state.count. Now the set interval is going to be firing a lot, very frequently. And so if we go look at here, whoa, we can see that this is going up very quickly. So let's just slow it down a bit. Let's change our interval to fire every 500 milliseconds. Whenever I changed it, notice it restarted the app. That means it reset the memory in the React component. And so now it's back to 0 and then counting up at a much more reasonable rate. But still, even with all those updates, it was still able to go very quickly. Not a problem. And so now what is happening is my React component, let's go back up here, the constructor fired, it started with Eric with a count of 0, component did mount, it set the name to Bob, and then started setting the count every 500 milliseconds up by 1. And so all of these are causing a re-render. And this will go indefinitely because I have this set interval here and I don't have anything there to stop it. Okay, so from this, let's recap. React components are these classes, and they have, at the very least, a render function. In this render function, you will return some HTML, sometimes just plain HTML, often, most often, I think, with these little variable things, these inserted values. Now, in this case, these inserted values come from state. State is data, essentially, that you store within the component. And you can change that over time, just like we're doing. Whenever you start with state in a component, you can set initial state like this in the constructor, but this is the only place where you set state when the this.state equals an object. Everywhere else, you will call setState. And you call setState, and you pass in what you want to change in state. In this case, I want to change the name Bob from Eric to Bob. And then here, every 500 milliseconds, I'm going to change the count and increment it by 1. And every time someone calls setState, it causes a re-render. And so that's why we see this re-rendering every half a second. And then, of course, the page updating. All right, so that's what we covered in this video. In the next video, we're going to talk about mapping. We're going to talk about essentially how would you take an array of data and put that array of data into a component.